Well, thank you all for joining us. You're being introduced on the screen behind us. Again, thank you for your time, and really glad that you could share your expertise with us. So let's jump right into it. Shafiq set us up really nicely. I mean, the thing that he said was, you've got this innovation pipeline, and then you make the business case, on an ROI basis. But and that's what we want to explore in this panel. And this is turning out to be a really hard challenge for most of our companies, because, I talked about the Disney example where they're being hammered by stock market analysts and other advisors about kind of $1 billion investment. And admittedly, we don't always spend $1 billion, but I can't tell you how many projects I've worked on where, big bosses say, where's the ROI on these investments? And so that's always hard, because some of it is intangible, some of it is unexpected, unpredictable. So it's both sort of executive buy-in and sort of external market validation of what it is we do. And then, one of the things we run a CIO group here, and one of the CIOs told me this great story where his or her bosses, I'll keep this as ambiguous as possible, said, he was told or she was told that you got to invest. If you want to invest in the new, then you can't get money for the old. And I was thinking about it and saying it's almost like building a second story in a one-story house and saying ignore the first floor while you build the second floor. And that just doesn't make any sense. But that's really sort of the challenges we face around how much money we have to invest. So with that, let us just jump into let's start with you, Jon. How do you characterize first start with what your businesses do, just to make sure everybody's on the same playing field, and let's talk a little bit about kind of where you are in your digital journey. And then we'll go with Jimmy and then Oren.
All right. I work for Oakley, which is a sport performance eyewear and apparel company. Hopefully you've heard of it. And hopefully you are happy about the fact that I dressed up for today. Normally I'd be in shorts and a t-shirt, so benefits of the job.
The jeans are called dressing up in the Oakley world.
This is. And from our kind of digital journey, I would say there's really 5 prongs to our digital journey. First is our traditional website, and we're really on generation 6 in my time. I've been with Oakley 18 years. And we're on the 6th generation of our website, completely redoing it. We've just redid it over about just almost a year ago now. And so that journey has been pretty far along, and that's both for branding, kind of community, and for e-commerce. Second component is in marketing. I would kind of categorize that as digital media, apps that are for kind of promoting and assisting in selling the product, and customer relationship management. Those areas, I would say, we're first generation, second generation on some of the media, but really first generation on the CRM and on some of the apps. So we have some apps that are a little bit older, but and then third kind of prong is really in-store technologies, using digital to enable things that historically weren't digital. iPads, use of iPads, use of computers. We have a program called the Oakley Custom Program, which helps you to kind of build and model a product to the liking that you want with the particular lens color you want, frame color you want, get etching on it and stuff like that. That's in-store technologies. I would say we're probably about third generation there. Next component is really in kind of processes, kind of, how do we improve and digitize processes? Use e-receipts, use e-invoices, get mobile apps to the front end we use SAP. We haven't really heard many people say that SAP is cool and sexy, so we're looking for mobilization ways to help improve the execution of SAP. And then the 5th prong is really on wearables. In our product itself, we had about 10 years ago, we had a product called Thump, which had a sunglass that had an MP3 player built into it. We came out with the next generation that had a Bluetooth enablement to listen to music. And we kind of did those, but we found those were really high dollar investments. And so we kind of put some of that on hold, but now we're getting back into it a little bit more. But helping with the help of some other people. We're partnering with Google on a glass for their, hopefully a more stylish glass for their Google Glass. And then also with Intel and a couple other partners to help kind of integrate wearables. We have some, from the work that we would do with Thump, we did a lot of patent work, and so we have a lot of kind of ownership of delivering in the headspace. So that's kind of where we're at.
Okay, you're patenting the headspace. That's interesting.
That's right.
Yeah, Jimmy?
I work for Standard Hotels. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer, which was a newly created position. I'm not sure if the title actually reflects what I do. I oversee sales, revenue, distribution, and marketing. And they gave me technology because I'm Asian. They had to throw that in. They would have given me accounting, but I said enough. So what I do is basically to make sure that we generate offline and online business in the most cost-effective manner to actually accelerate the brand proposition to the local community. I say that we're in the hotel business, but what we actually do that's more important is that we create local cultural hubs for the districts in which we operate in. And oftentimes we seek out districts that are up and coming. So for those who know about our hotels, we were one of the first hotels in the meatpacking district, West Hollywood, downtown LA, and this small district in Miami off the Strip. So what we do is we create the cultural hub in which we enliven the five senses of the people around there and actually validates the rising of the community in terms of food, wine, music, sound, books, and so on. So people come and gather at our places, and we happen to sell guest rooms as well. So what we do from a cultural standpoint absolutely is critical from the technology tools, not to basically do it for the technology's sake, but use the technology to enable our guest experience and the cultural experience that we bring forth to the hotels. So one of our biggest initiatives, and I'll just state it in a roundabout way, Shafiq stated you have to own the consumer, and he was talking on and on about aggregators from what I've heard. The big advantage that we have, and big advantage of any direct supplier ought to know, is that there are aggregators, of course, like Expedia, and even OpenTable to a degree. I know there's a speaker later in OpenTable. But they basically lose their customer after their initial sale. We actually are building the bridge with our consumer relationship management solutions to bring not only their profile or their email database, let's say, but to actually recognize what they do from their on-property experience. So every point or every click that they make or every time they spend, use their credit card with us, we're capturing that information so that we could actually give a better experience and better marketing than the aggregators can from their initial experience. I brought up OpenTable. I just naturally assumed that they had a CRM solution, but they basically lose their customer once the customer reaches the restaurant. Expedia loses their customer once they open the doors and come to the front desk. We're actually bridging the F&B experience as well as the guest room experience and every point in between. And we're placing a big investment to make sure that we have the digital marketing capabilities to touch point them in the most effective way from the overall conversion funnel.
Oren, you work for a very different kind of company, so let's explain a little bit about Frost Data Capital.
Yeah, I do, and I usually start by saying two things that we're not. So we're not really a venture fund, and we're not really an incubator. But that's what we started out doing, is trying to do software ventures in a new way. So we're a group of serial software entrepreneurs who got together and tried to rethink the venture model a little bit. But that's something that's evolved over the last few years, and where we find ourselves now is we've built some really exciting relationships with various large corporates, and what we've now become is an engine that provides a third way for large corporates to drive disruptive innovation. So where you might otherwise rely on sort of internal innovation efforts, internal incubation, and maybe some corporate venturing, corporate M&A, What we're doing is working with large corporates to build ecosystems of startups. So they're independent startup ventures. We work with corporate partners to co-invest in those. And we build a group of companies around a general investment theme and then manage those very closely. So they're much more aligned with the kind of risk appetite and planning that corporates want to do. And we've got one key relationship with GE, which is very interesting. I think we'll talk about it later. It ties into some of the examples that you were using when you introduced the conference. And we're now evolving that into a kind of model that we're repeating across multiple large corporates.
So just in a sentence, they've got a deal where they will incubate and launch 10 startups for GE each year for the next 3 years, if I remember the numbers correctly. It's pretty close to that. So Oren, staying with you then, making the case for, for digital investment has always been difficult. We've heard this from executives. One of the executives in banking told me this a few years ago when she started working for City National Bank. One of the challenges that she faced was there was so much demand for projects that it became really hard to choose. What she also said was, you didn't teach me enough about this stuff. Well, the truth was, I didn't know how to teach about that stuff. Because digital is very different from traditional IT. It was hard enough to, figure out what the ROI was on traditional IT projects. How do you see the world shifting in terms of the business case piece? Like, why is this so hard? Why are companies struggling so much with sort of understanding what the ROI is? Because, you've got this imperative, everybody keeps telling us now, you have to invest. And yet we're encountering a resistance in terms of, because the ROI is not that clear. Our research supports that as well.
Well, it's the first part of this is that it's a relatively straightforward but very, very, very difficult problem is that your business model is not necessarily clear. So if we see this through the lens of startups, but it's true about internal projects as well, that if you're developing particular kinds of transformative digital initiatives, you don't necessarily know starting out what the business model is going to be, let alone being able to quantify the ROI. So it needs a different kind of planning and a different kind of appetite for risk and uncertainty than corporates have traditionally been able to deploy. And in some ways, that's the easier part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that where these new initiatives seem in some degree to be disruptive to existing business units. I think you talked about GE, and Jeff Immelt talks about the power of 1%, which sounds fantastic. GE becomes a software company. They create software products that give people 1% savings in, say, how they manage and maintain a pump in an oil well, major piece of equipment. But what you don't necessarily think about straight away is that 1% comes out of the bottom line of one of GE's existing business units. Right. So that's a very difficult thing to balance, and GE have balanced it in a couple of ways. One is by building this separate center in San Ramon with $1 billion a year investment, with a new head. It's now going to become a separate BU. And another way is that they've partnered with us to build what they've called the Incubator Industrial Internet to do this externally. But those are really the two really major challenges you have when you're trying to make the case for these things. Yeah, so what you're really saying is a lot of it is like investing in a new business rather than investing in a project. Jon, what about you? How do things work at Oakley?
Well, if I think about kind of what we're looking at from a traditional versus a digital or kind of new technologies, traditional had a defined, from an IT perspective, had a defined customer base, had a defined kind of set of requirements typically, and you could calculate out a return on investment. So if you're going to do a new planning system, you can calculate what the cost is going to do that, who the user population is, what the savings are going to be out of leveraging that, and it was very definable. And the costs for once you'd implement that were a little bit lower for switching because it's all internal customers. When you're talking about digital, largely speaking, it's all about external consumers or external customers. That could be sales associates in stores. That could be true consumers. That could be third-party representation on our behalf. And if our applications or our digital media that we're providing don't work, the customer can go use something else. And so your requirements are a little bit harder because you're trying to differentiate the experience to win the customer with that differentiated experience. And if you don't win, they can go to, hey, Sunglass Hut happens to be a Luxottica company, so it's a bad example because I'm part of Luxottica, but Sunglass Hut, or they could go to Solstice, which is a different company. They could go somewhere else if they didn't like the experience with us. And so that makes it a lot more difficult. And so the other thing is that you're pushing the very limits of, gosh, is this even going to win a customer? Because ultimately we want to win the customer, get traffic, drive revenue, and so forth. But we're doing things like we put out an app. We have an app called Surfline, or leverages Surfline, which is a surf report. So if you're a surfer, you want to find out, hey, what's the waves in Trestles? Who's surfing at Trestles? Are any of my buddies at Trestles? You can do that. We signed up for that. We signed a contract to that. It costs us a little bit of money, but that's a bit of a risk. It's not the billion-dollar risk that that Disney was taking. I work on smaller numbers, but that's kind of a risk that you want to see if that traffic's really going to be driving something. And sometimes, because these are bleeding-edge technologies, you don't always get the results you're looking for. Totally different case, a positive case, back to Luxottica. We put in a digital technology in Luxottica stores for lens crafters, and it's called AccuFit. So when you go in, it checks where your pupils are to make sure that we get the right seg height for your prescription glasses. What's interesting about that is we had this camera that takes a picture of the person, and what we found is we thought it was going to save us a bunch of money on the execution of more accurate glasses, less rework on the glasses, and that did in fact happen. But what really improved was the conversion of people seeing themselves, getting pictures taken of themselves in the glasses that they were wearing. They couldn't see themselves when they were trying on glasses because they needed prescriptions, right? So they put their prescriptions back on, they get to see themselves, and so we got a much higher conversion rate of people seeing themselves in the new glasses and a much happier satisfaction level, nothing of which we had anticipated. So, hey, how'd you predict that in a business case? That's a hard thing to know because you're on the bleeding edge.
So it's funny that you say that because I think all of us who wear glasses have had that problem. You take your glasses, but it is interesting. So, Oren and Jon, you've really made our lives difficult, right? It's like, okay, we don't know how to do this. So, Jimmy, I'm going to give you the tough question. So, how do you do this? It's like, how do you we have to move forward. How do you make the business case for these things which are so difficult to quantify when there may be a tangible benefit? And I've heard this from company after company. Like you go in with one ROI, and we'll hear this a lot from the platform company, and the way they grow their systems out as they understand kind of what future option value there is in the previous investment. How do you approach it? How do you convince sort of the guys who hold the purse strings to sort of release for this versus that and release the funds more broadly?
I'm fortunate in the sense that we have a leadership mindset in the company where it's not always direct numbers driven. We stay true to our brand mission and focus, and everything derives from there. We invest in technology and we make these decisions that will enable our consumer base, our targeted audience, to extend their experience in better and more meaningful ways. So when we do make the investments in digital, and I do argue that I think the measurement of digital investment, technology investment is far more feasible than ever today. It's just that maybe you just have to do a deeper due diligence and encompassing a deeper set of metrics. But what we don't do is we don't chase the digital tail just because an app, just because the next smartwatch is going to be coming out. We're not scrambling to bring apps into the watch world. In fact, when I joined the company, which was, it hasn't even been a year, it's been like 10 months, we had no digital or technology infrastructure. I'm not sure if that was by design, probably not, but our first entryway into the digital world cost us nominal dollars. And it's actually going to be released into the public marketplace. And it's a very, very simple app called One Night Standard. And if you think about the name, it's sort of, there's a real tangible way you can really extend the experience. So now,
we're talking hotels.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So again, the environment that we create, our sense of extending the senses, our restaurants, our our nighttime rooftop bars, and even our lobby where people congregate to just, again, get more out of life. This wasn't very costly, but we also acknowledged what people were doing outside of the hotel space. For example, we took the same credit card payment solution processing system that Uber, Airbnb, and Hotel Tonight uses, called Braintree. They are actually some of the technology behind Apple Pay as well. That didn't cost us any money. That's a pay-for-play performance. But the fact that we're enabling that to come into our app world now makes our app a one-stop booking process as well. And the fact that we want to have that dynamic feel, again, the dynamic lifestyle is what our brand represents. We're just extending that into the technology field. So if the technology enables our brand mission, that's where we'll go.
So do you have a strategic partnership with Tinder? Actually, don't answer that.
No, they want
I don't want to know the answer. This is still, we're still a university here. So that's one mission. That's brand. So obviously, so that's kind of what's your value proposition to your customers? How do you kind of focus on that? I suspect you're a little bit. Everybody cares about their brand, but you're really trying to create an experience as well. So Jon, from your perspective, like, what does it take to convince? I know you're the CEO as well as the CIO, but like the CFO, for like, what are they looking for, and has anything changed? Like, how do you make what makes for a better business case that our audience can go to their bosses with and say, release some more money? What works and what doesn't work?
Well, I think it's really moved some of the metrics, instead of just being on return on investment, to a few different things. One is if I take the different categories that we're focused on, they're all ultimately driving adoption or traffic. They're driving conversion, and they're driving average unit transaction. And then if you talk about some of the processes, it's probably driving cost savings. But ultimately, all the things we're doing are along those metrics. Now, the execution may change, right? So if it's our website, we're looking at traffic, meaning how many people are visiting our website, how long are they spending on our website, because for us, we want to be a community component as well. So we want people to hang out on our website to help build the community, interact, and focus on kind of just being part of an active sport community or active lifestyle community. So we want to have long session times. Ultimately, we see that the more time they spend on our sites and doing stuff related to our site, then the conversion's probably going to go up. And ultimately, the traffic's going to go up if they're spending the time to find out all the different things we make. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. We can do that in our retail stores as well. The challenge to me in some of these metrics comes out when you start talking about mixed channels or omni-channel, so buy online, pick up in store. Now you're crossing barriers that it's really hard to get what would be perceived as a relatively straightforward metric to get that metric. And that's, I think, where we find the biggest challenge for our executive group to say, okay, are we really going to get this conversion rate if it's buy online and pick up in store? Is it really going to elevate our total sales? Is it really going to improve our total experience? Those are the biggest challenges, is how do we get some footprints out there, get some quick wins, some fast failures to evolve where we want to get to see that we're raising at minimum those three metrics. And the metrics are broad that I'm saying. There's details for any different channel.
So there's something that you said that I want to explore further, which is engagement, which I think is really powerful. And we hear this time and time again. So if you look at all these, what people used to call crazy evaluations for the social networks like Facebook and whatever, or these, what people paid for WhatsApp, what Facebook paid for WhatsApp. There's this professor at NYU, Damodaran, who's done some phenomenal work where he says, if you look at it at a cash flow basis, it just doesn't seem to make sense. And he says, I'm still not arguing for the other point of view, but I can explain these high valuations. And he says, three things matter: number of users, growth rate of the number of users, and level of consumer engagement. And they can often predict how valuable and for social networks, that kind of makes sense. But I think, and when I was talking to Oren earlier, we talked about how he works with some health insurance companies, and it's something that is very difficult to value because there's a lot of switching between one plan to another from year to year, and if you can somehow engage these consumers better, you can get them to stick. So Oren, how do you think, so these VC firms, right? are able to invest in these risky startups. Now we see Fidelity Investments investing in Uber. From your point of view, your vantage point where you sit, how do you see sort of the venture capital world? Why are they able to do this, and why do kind of traditional companies find it harder? Are there any lessons that we can take away from the VC world?
Yeah, and so some things are pretty basic things that might be difficult to translate. So some things are around just basic risk appetite. So
Sure.
a VC business model can work well if you have 2 successes out of 10. If you do that as an executive, you're going to get fired.
Right.
So you need to either change your expectations, which is probably unlikely, or find ways of working within a risk model that's acceptable to a corporate environment. So that's not terribly helpful, but that's one of the things that is a challenge, and that means that they can do things that are difficult for an enterprise to do. I think another part of this is, which particularly applies to early stage, when you're trying to build up these projects, is a different way of thinking about how you measure and understand progress. Because if you translate progress into traditional milestones, into measures against ROI, into delivery milestones, that works quite poorly for a startup. And I love the kind of Stephen Blank has this quote about startup being a temporary organization which searches for a repeatable business model. And you have to kind of think of it like that. And if you think of it like that, you stop trying to measure it in terms of ROI, in terms of sales, in terms of delivery milestones. And one of the things that we've had to do, and it's involved a lot of work, is develop a really precise, common language for thinking about strategy in detail that we all share. Because that gives you a way, because what you're doing in the very early stage of these projects is developing a strategy. You have to develop by experimentation, you have to develop with customer contact, and you won't know your metrics until you've developed your strategy. So what you kind of need to do is develop this very precise language for a deep way of thinking about how you define strategy and how you define progress towards a strategy, which is kind of backwards because you'd expect to have your strategy first, but with these initiatives you often can't.
You know, I hadn't thought about this before, but as you were talking, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, because I had a conversation with somebody whose request for investment was turned down, and he thought that actually his funders didn't kind of get the point, didn't get the case. And as we kind of brainstormed some more, what we learned was they actually had different visions of the future. So the problem wasn't that they weren't willing to fund the investment, it was they had never agreed on what the future would be. And so I think what you're saying is that we really need to make sure we have a common process with strategy, and even kind of, and Shafiq said this earlier too, it's like we have to spend a lot of time on, I don't like this phrase too much, but scenario planning. Right, so we really sort of have to have a common understanding in the executive suite about where we're going. With that, let me turn it over to the floor for questions, and we'll bring it back. Professor Venkatesh, back there.
Hi, my name is Aladi Venkatesh. I'm on the faculty at UC Irvine. I have a great presentation, great session, thank you, and the previous speakers also. I'm enjoying it thoroughly, being away from my academic obligations. My question is, how are you factoring the social media in your business or digital strategies? What are some of the challenges or 2 or 3 issues that you're facing, and what is your takeaway on the social media side of a business, if you're doing it?
Go ahead.
So I think just a couple comments maybe on that. And one is that we're trying to build the community that I mentioned. So if you're in sports or activities, we want to have a connection back to the athletes, and so we're trying to incorporate some of our athletes and people that wear our product to kind of get involved in social media and actually have dialogues with our customers through the site. So that's one way that we're trying to leverage social media to try to build the community, and obviously do it through our site to help connect to our brand. Second is that we're doing basic things like rating and reviews, which again is getting consumer feedback, although it's not an official social media avenue, but it's getting consumer feedback onto our site. There's both on our site, and then there's some kind of non-Oakley sponsored sites that do ratings and reviews on our product. We don't have an association directly with the non-sponsored ones, but we know people are talking about our product, so we want to make sure that we're facilitating that on our website as well. And then third is, to make sure that the right things are understood about our brand out there. We monitor social media and make sure that there's not a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of our brand going out there, or if there's somebody who's unhappy and they're using social media to talk about it, that we address the issues. So to me, those are, particularly that last one's an imperative now in the marketplace.
Other questions from the audience? Back there, in the center, right under the clock.
Hi, this is Mandar Joshi from Ingram Micro. My question is to Jon about when we are on this digital revolution path, adoption being one of the big parameters in consideration. When we launch new initiatives, how do we predict more accurately, our adoption is going to be maximum? And what kind of role would it play if it is not, while we are investing big money in any of these initiatives?
Could you summarize that right at the end there? Sorry.
Yeah, so I was looking forward to what are the key parameters that we would look forward to when seeing that our adoption is going to be maximum or maximizing our adoption.
So what are the parameters that you use if you want to maximize adoption of whatever technology you roll out?
So if it depends, let's say if it's for our website, well, no, let's take the Oakley custom program example that we put in the store. It was really, I go back to the main metrics that we talked about in the beginning, as far as kind of what were the key metrics that we wanted to achieve. We wanted to get a buzz with the consumer, so customer use and satisfaction. We wanted to drive more revenue, and we wanted to get a higher transaction value. Ultimately, those were our objectives. The parameters that we used to kind of assess how we were going to execute that is we looked at what we're doing with Oakley Custom, where we saw, so I mean, to me, some of what we do with Oakley Custom is we have different things we can change. We tried to assess through different user groups what the value proposition was for the consumers, where they got the most satisfaction. Did they like being able to etch on the lens? Did they like to be able to change the lens, make the different colors? So we tried to get some feedback of where we thought the successes were going to be to help justify doing the project and to get the return on investment, and then monitor it after the fact. So in that case, it was really, we had a little bit of advantage because we were already doing custom, and so it was a more building a tool for in-store. Cost us roughly about $700,000 to do and to roll out, so we could build a bit of a business case, and we knew what the parameters were, which is we wanted more user adoption in-store and get a buzz to bring people across the lease line to come into the store to execute. And if they're across the lease line, whether it was for Oakley Custom, then the probability of them doing something else in the store was increased. I don't know if that addresses your question.
So Jon, this thing, trade-off about balancing the old versus the new, I was thinking about. So Jimmy said he didn't have too much of a digital infrastructure when he took over this job a year ago, so this question doesn't apply to him. And so, obviously there's Oakley and then there's Luxottica. For those if you don't know, Oakley is a division of Luxottica. And so you've obviously brought a big legacy to